Seems that the European Commission has first agreed the countries and the amounts they want to distribute, and then made up the criteria for it.
I have my favorite guest, Tuomas Malinen, the CEO of GnS Economics, with me. So those who watch this outside Finland don't know that Tuomas has been the most favorite guest in the various YouTube channels, and over 200,000 people have watched you this year. So what you say resonates. In my channel there has been something like 50,000 views, and we started our discussing the COVID-19 when it hit in March, and now it has mutated to the stealth federation in EU.
Stealth federalization,
yeah. So if you take a couple of slides and discuss how this has happened. So the first slide, breaking the law. So which laws EU is about to break with this new federal?
They are, I don't know the actual laws, but they are in the treaties. So they are articles. And the thing is that what we agreed, or what the European leaders agreed on the beginning of July, is a new fund that will operate through the budget of the European Union, and this is something that has never been done before. So the idea is that the EU takes 750 billion borrows from the international financial markets and distributes 390 billion from it as grants, and gives 360 billion as loans to various countries. And actually this whole process will break the Article 310, which states in simple terms that the EU must operate a balanced budget, which it doesn't now, as it takes a massive deficit, which is financed through lending or borrowing, that is. And then there's also the Article 125 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, which states that we do not share the budget burden amongst the European Union nations. And when the EU takes borrows and gives out a grant, it gives it directly into the budget of the member nations. So this is a fiscal transfer, which is banned in Article 125. And what makes this, what we discuss next, is who pay and who receive these grants. But what makes this really absurd is that the fact that the distribution of funds from the EU budget from this fund are based on the population, on the level of GDP per capita, and unemployment between 2015 and 2019. These have absolutely nothing to do with the coronavirus pandemic. This is a transfer of the European Union into a fiscal transfer union, and this is a very fundamental change. Yeah. And it gets even weirder when you look at who gets the funds.
Yeah, if you look at the sort of official reason, which is the solidarity payment to kickstart the investments in Europe because of the unfortunate humanitarian loss of the COVID-19, but that doesn't really compute. If you look at who's paying and who's receiving, now we have in contrast to the 2008 and following crisis, the non-euro countries are paying. So Denmark and Sweden willingly pay transfers.
Willingly.
And they gang up with the Austrians and the Dutch in this frugal 4. Yeah. Finland was kind of a hang-around member of that club, but didn't quite dare to do anything dangerous.
Yeah.
But then we have they all pay, and that's why they were the frugal 4. So they try to stop this transfer union. Germany, Finland willingly pay. And then who receives both euro countries and non-euro countries. So we have like Estonia, which has like one of the most beautiful COVID-19 track records in the world, and they get like a surprise grant of several billion, which is pretty much exactly the same amount we pay.
Yeah.
And
so they get our money.
Yeah, Sweden has quite a lot of COVID damages. They pay a lot. And then we have like a Hungary and Poland who don't really count that much in that register, but they just get the money because they get it in those criteria.
Yeah.
So there doesn't seem to be any correlation with this systematic shock of what we're having.
No, and the Finnish economist Vesa Vihriälä, who has worked also on the EU Commission, stated just when the fund was agreed that it seems that the European Commission has first agreed the countries and the amounts they want to distribute, and then made up the criteria for it. And this is how it absolutely looks, because the thing is that if you argue that this would be to help countries to fight the corona, this would be the worst possible principles you would based on the distribution of funds. And also the distribution of countries is all skewed towards those who are poorer or who have lost the GDP per capita growth, for example, or have high unemployment. So this is a big lie that the EU is telling us, and our leaders, our national leaders, are trying to tell us. This has nothing to do with corona except in the name, maybe. So 70% of the funds will be distributed on the criteria which based on economic developments before the coronavirus hit. And this is a really strange concept, and you can only kind of see it in a way that this is the way to push European Union into fiscal federation without asking the consent of the people.
And I think the fundamental reason why we need to pay this is euro, and now we come to that. So if one of the criteria is the GDP per head, then euro has, in I guess our opinion, definitely contributed to the flattening the curve. And then the unemployment, the same thing. I think euro has contributed to the increasing the unemployment level. So in fact, if we use those as a criteria, we are in effect trying to fix the euro by stealth. Yeah. So we could actually now have a look of the couple of euro countries. This is a GnS Economics analysis of the GDP per capita. And you have grouped these into two sets of countries. We have a kind of neutral, so even beneficiaries of euro.
Beneficiaries, yeah. Sure. Yeah.
So we have countries like Germany and Austria, and surprisingly Portugal and Spain, and then we have a kind of losers, Finland, Italy, and Greece. As a Finn, I don't quite like being grouped in that way. Well, can you explain a little bit?
Yeah. So first of all, Germany and Austria, they have grown very strongly all through the Euro membership, and actually also Spain and Portugal have grown, but the most importantly is that Spain and Portugal have recovered from the 2008 crisis, so their GDP per capita is higher than in 2007. This doesn't apply to Finland, Italy, and Greece. So Greece is the biggest loser. Her GDP per capita is 20% lower now than when she joined the euro in 2001. In Italy is I think it was at the end of 2019, her capita was something like GDP per capita was something like minus 1.6 lower, and Finland has Finland's GDP per capita is quite close to the level we had now at the end of 2008, quite close to the level we had in 2007. So what makes these all losers is that first of all, that Italy and Greece, they have all kind of lost their welfare during the Eurozone membership, and Finland has not recovered from the 2008 financial crisis. And this is the crucial thing. And Finland is there because of the fact that we have a very small or narrow export sector, which is based on basically on investment goods. And we have always flourished when we have had our own currency, but when it has been tied to some other currency, our economy has kind of stagnated. And the fact is that we need a currency that follows the economic realities of Finland, and of course the realities of our export partners. But the euro does not do that. It follows mostly Germany's economic development and maybe even France. So it's cheap. Euro can be argued to be cheap for Germany, but very expensive for Finland. And that's why Finland is also in this group.
And that's a key point. So in this EU federalization, we are taking the possibility of actually having non-euro countries and euro countries having a different sort of federal union. Because in the past, the strategy of the non-euro countries was to not participate in the payments. They skipped all these previous mechanisms which were created to do transfers on the loan basis. Like the European stability mechanism. So they were not member of this. But crucially, first time we couple the future of Euro and EU. But if we sort of have a look, if we can still prevent this coupling and look at how countries could fare outside Euro. We could take an example of one of these countries, and I pick randomly Finland. So this is your analysis of the interest rates 10-year government bonds, and we compare Sweden, Finland, and Eurozone. And Sweden, of course, has throughout the after the EMU crisis of the early 90s, they have stayed with the floating krona. Could you explain what's happening here?
Well, it just shows that the 10-year government bonds or the interest rates have been falling both in Finland and in Sweden, and of course in the Eurozone. So this is kind of a internal domestic matter. So there has been arguments made by some who defend the euro in Finland that our interest rates would be very high if we would be outside the euro. Well, this of course does not apply. You could add any Eurozone country to this and it would show the same decline from the very high levels of the early 1990s when, for example, Finland and Sweden had their massive banking crisis. So it just shows that there is no arguments to be made based on the fact that the interest rates have fallen globally and especially here.
So the interest argument doesn't work. So if you look at the other favorite argument, it's that then the currency would be too volatile, sort of like a rubbish currency, and you have simulated that as well. So you have a history of Finnish Markka against the dollar, I guess here, and euro, and then simulation what could have happened if he had stayed like a Sweden.
So we did kind of this kind of synthetic Markka, which we simulated here. So there has been a long run dependency relationship between the Swedish krona and the Finnish Markka throughout all the previous decades. So we use that, and we also use the interest rate differentials and the economic developments of the world to construct this theoretical value of Markka. And surprisingly, in our theoretical simulations, the value of the Markka fluctuates less than the value of the euro against the dollar, for example. So it doesn't really fly that we would have a very based on this, it doesn't fly that we would have a very kind of a weak currency. But what it would do, it would help us during the crisis, like in 2008, and then it would have also depreciated during the last few years. And what we also did that we simulated the development of our exports based on this, and they show that if we would have remained in the Markka, our exports would have been in the first quarter of this year been some 40% higher than they are now. Which kind of it's a lot of money. And it would kind of it would imply that in a rough estimate our GDP would be about 10% higher. So this is a very big thing to Finland, and it just shows that why Finland should be outside the euro. We should have our own currency.
So if we take this back to the second slide, then that's very much explains why our GDP is flat. I mean, it would have recovered much better in the Swedish
that's
system.
highly. We cannot say that for sure, but that's highly likely.
Yeah. So, but now we have decided as European Union to take this to our national parliaments for approval. What was your word for this stealth?
Stealth federalization.
Yeah.
And this is the last stage. This has been going on since 2010 when there was the Greece debt crisis. So this has been going on for the Greece and the European debt crisis, and now we're at the final stages, because after this, if we agree to back the borrowing of the EU, then we are locked kind of in the system. So only way to leave that system from the recovery fund is getting out of the EU and defaulting also. So this is the final stage of the stealth federalization, which has been going on for 10 years.
Yeah, and that also means that the consequences of backing down are not so easy as just switching to a benign own currency, but you have to go like the British route and go outside, and on top of that even have to break the euro at the same prices, so that can be pretty damaging.
That would be very damaging. So before we go into this, every nation, and because the changes to what it brings to the EU are so drastic, every country should have a referendum on the recovery fund. That's the only way to know for sure that the citizens of Europe really back this, and this is not some stealth European project of the European elite.
Yeah, yeah, because now we have, if this goes through, then we have a case study of how these European Union articles don't mean anything, and we can repeat this as many times.
Yeah,
the politicians wish.
Any economic emergency we declare there have been,
and we willingly give away the democratic tools in the member nation to vote against it.
Yeah.
Or at least it will be so much harder.
Much harder,
yeah.
So, there's a very high likelihood that if we go back down this path, it will lead to the demise of the European Union altogether at some point. So we have to stop it now and return to the idea of a kind of a free European Union, which is a kind of a league of nations, if you may. And it's not the federation. We have never agreed to go into federation. Now our leaders are trying to push us there in a very stealth and cunning way, actually.
Yeah, so now it's the year to either agree on this, but that doesn't mean that we just watch it happen in slow motion and then mutter in our beards, but we actually need to take to your parliament and decide that whether this is the way we want to
and
go.
Hopefully go also to the citizens, ask the citizens, have referendums, please.
Yeah. Thanks. So this is kind of the discussion we've been having in Finland, not in the sort of official channels, but like I said, over 200,000 people have been watching at least Tuomas give this kind of a message. So thank you. I have been discussing with Tuomas Malinen, the CEO of GnS Economics.
Thank you.